Welcome to Tracy's Terrors. If you love horror and appreciate smart animal commentary, then you are in the right place. Today, Strigoi, VamPullet, and I will be discussing Lisa Tuttle's 2004 novella, My Death. As a reader of horror, I rarely encounter tales of time travel and its effects on subjectivity, topics that are typically reserved for science fiction and fantasy. While I usually steer clear of these genres, and that is just my personal preference and not a statement by any means of their quality, I think that I would enjoy them more if their tropes were stripped of techno-aesthetics and disentangled from the complicated rules of overbuilt worlds, qualities that you can sometimes find in sci-fi and fantasy. And that's exactly what Lisa Tuttle does in her novella, My Death. Interpreting temporal loops and bizarre models of selfhood through the lens of folk horror, she crafts this really unsettling book that combines space-time glitches with pagan gods and cursed islands. She adds an almost cosmic dimension to horror's favorite climactic reveal or twist. You know, the self-deceiving protagonist. She offers a new take on that. And she communicates the dizzying sense of a circular self through the really brilliant use of metafictional or postmodern techniques. To be sure, there's a lot more going on in this text than postmodern cleverness and the repurposing of sci-fi elements, you know, for horror. She also considers the experience of grief, the erasure of women artists, and you know, even the consumption of sexually explicit art. It's her intimate and insightful exploration of those topics that initially got me invested in the narrator. But by the end of My Death, I had left the familiar ground of these feminist concerns and entered a new and exciting territory, a space between genre categories where, you know, the shiny, speculative gambits of sci-fi and fantasy assume a darker hue and a more realistic hue. So if you too are a sci-fi phobe, but you're interested in exploring some of its traditional concepts in a horror context, then consider picking up My Death. So let's get into the summary. In My Death, the narrator, who is unnamed throughout, is an American expat and an author living in Scotland. Since the death of her husband about a year and a half before, she has been unable to write anything and is really anxious to get her career back on track by writing a biography of Helen Elizabeth Ralston. Now, herself, an American expat and a writer, Ralston is remembered, if she's ever remembered, as the muse of a painter named W.E. Logan, and she is also the only witness to an incident that changed his life. When the couple visited a small island, Logan was mysteriously blinded, and Ralston, after sailing him back to the mainland, left Scotland for Paris and never spoke to him again. After that, you know, her career as an artist and a writer was just sort of largely forgotten. So the narrator's straightforward research project takes a really surreal turn when she interviews the 96-year-old Ralston, who is still alive. And Ralston describes dreams and memories that are uncannily similar to the narrator's own. And the narrator asks herself, how can such personal and seemingly unique experiences be shared with a woman she's never met before? Is she the dupe of a conspiracy, the victim of some kind of a conspiracy, or is she the unconscious partner in a relationship that defies space and time? Ooh. My Death offers an original take on one of the most commonly used twists in horror, and that is the self-deceiving protagonist. While suffering from, you know, split personality disorder or unconsciously reenacting repressed trauma, and remember, here I'm using the faux psychology that we find in the horror genre, the sunny main characters in works that rely on this trope have no access to the darker parts of their psyches. These darker parts of themselves are like dank basements inhabited by sinister shadow selves. So we're all familiar with scenes in which the protagonist looks down at his or her bloodied hands and realizes that the killer is within. You know, they've murdered all these people and had no idea that there was a part of themselves that was capable of these crimes. The horror of Tuttle's novel, or what's terrifying about it, isn't that the narrator has a murderous alternative persona. I mean, far from it. It's not that at all. But it's that the self of the narrator is structured in such a wholly unexpected way. I tried to correlate its contours and workings with the pop culture conception of reincarnation, the interpretive framework that I think probably comes closest to the version of selfhood that Tuttle describes. But while the transmigration of souls accounts for some of it, other parts of this self are just completely unexplained by that model. So what's happening to the narrator is much weirder than a past life recollection or the stirrings of a restless subconscious mind. Her experience suggests a self with a truly alien configuration, one and yet not quite one, that seems to transcend the material world and yet is bound to specific bodies, one that exists simultaneously in different forms but with selective awareness or selective self-awareness. The very possibility of this mode of being unnerves me far more than the standard mental schism that we see affecting characters in horror. I love My Death because it packages the sci-fi theme of time travel in the wrappings of horror, making it accessible to people like me who avoid books with complicated world building or detailed descriptions of speculative technologies. I get to play with the idea of temporal loops without having to learn about the TARDIS or TARDI, and other space gadgetry. What Tuttle describes here is much more basic and even primal. Instead of being the product of cutting-edge human efforts like intricate machinery and Hawking-level physics, the wormhole, for lack of a better term, in My Death seems to be an ancient feature of a desolate island, which may or may not be an embodiment of a pagan goddess. Whether the time loop is an expression of this deity, a special talent tied to this primeval force in its land, is never spelled out. It's totally ambiguous, but it is implied, and that is enough to situate this typically sci-fi phenomena firmly in the territory of folk horror, where I was very happy to find it. The circularity, both of time and of lives, is a central theme in My Death, and it's reflected in the metafictional style that Tuttle uses, and processing this style left me feeling, appropriately given the subject matter, disoriented. As Amy Gentry points out in the introduction to the novella, there's significant overlap between the lives of Tuttle, the narrator, and Ralston. All three are American expatriate authors. And the narrator, like Tuttle, is a writer of science fiction who has lived in Scotland since the 1980s. Now, for me, this layering of the three created a sense of genre slippage, in which I was constantly and unintentionally shifting my relationship to the text, approaching it first as fiction and then autobiography and then back again. Faced with a detail about the narrator or Ralston, I would experience this sense of deja vu. Did I already read this in Gentry's biography of Tuttle, or did I read about it in relation to some other character? Where did I first see this? And of course, Tuttle could not anticipate what her readers would know about her. And so part of this is probably unintentional. But what is intentional and an effective device for aligning the narrator's and the reader's experience is Tuttle's figuring of the book itself into its own narrative. My Death is ostensibly the main character's autobiography, but it's also represented in the book as an externally produced object that she stumbles upon and describes in great detail, from its binding to its plot. So the book itself becomes an agent that acts upon the narrator and ultimately determines the course of the story. While I often find this kind of postmodern self-reflexivity overwrought and distracting, here it totally works, and for two reasons. Firstly, The temporally vexing status of the book isn't apparent until the final chapters, which means that I didn't have time to tie myself up in knots thinking about it. I just didn't have the time because it really is at the end. And secondly, it creates a delicious, and I'm going to mess this up because I have a lisp, but a very delicious Sixth Sense, M. Night Shyamalan's movie, like twist. The kind of twist we see there, that jump that I had at the end of that movie, I experienced in Tuttle's My Death. And that's just what I'm looking for in a book. Like M. Night Shyamalan's movie, My Death begins by leading you in one direction and ends up taking you somewhere else entirely. At first, I was focusing on three paths: the narrator getting her life back on track, the historical forgetting of women artists, and the reception of difficult works of art. But while all of these topics are launched, they never take flight into full stories. And that's because they are not the real subject of the book. Transcending grief, misogyny, and even art, its true subject is the narrator's self-discovery and the awful sublimity of her realization that at a profound level, she is not who she thinks she is. Now, if you enjoyed today's episode and would like to hear more from the three of us, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we will see you next time.